It began quietly, too quietly. In the early hours of January, when families across Burkina Faso were settling into a new year, emergency calls and whispered warnings started to ripple through Ouagadougou. No gunfire, no explosions. Just a tightening silence, the kind that tells you something serious is unfolding behind closed doors. By morning, the country would learn what authorities say was narrowly avoided, a coordinated plot allegedly set in motion on the night of January 3rd into the 4th, aimed at eliminating the head of state Ibrahim Traoré and crippling key security infrastructure. What shocked many was not only the timing, but the audacity. This was not described as political disagreement or street unrest. It was presented as an assassination plan, cold, organized, and deliberate. Then came the name that reignited old wounds. Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, former transition leader now living in exile, was publicly identified by Burkina Faso's authorities as the alleged mastermind. From Lomé, officials claimed threads were being pulled, phone calls made, money discussed, orders relayed. Whether true or not, the accusation alone was enough to place the entire region on edge. For older American viewers who remember the Cold War proxy conflicts and the long shadow of coups across Africa, this moment feels uncomfortably familiar. A nation trying to chart a new course suddenly finds itself staring down the same question it has faced for decades. Can stability survive when former power brokers refuse to let go? And there's a larger dilemma here, one that extends beyond Burkina Faso. If a former leader is accused of coordinating violence from exile, what responsibility does the host country carry? Should tradition give way to security, or does extradition risk opening an even darker chapter? Tonight, we are not here to shout slogans or rush to verdicts. We are here to understand what is being claimed, why it matters, and what it could mean for the future of the Sahel and for Africa's long struggle between reform and recurrence. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective? Yet can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré, or should Burkina Faso prepare for a different path? Please share if you feel you are among the first to closely follow and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. What unfolded in early January 2026 was not presented by authorities as rumor, speculation, or political theater. It was described carefully and repeatedly as an active operation already in motion, one that Burkina Faso's internal security services say they intercepted just in time. According to official statements relayed to the public, the critical window was the night of January 3rd into January 4th, 2026. While most citizens were unaware intelligence units were tracking movements they believed pointed toward a coordinated attack. The alleged objective was stark: the physical elimination of Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso, alongside the neutralization of strategic security infrastructure essential to state defense. The government's version of events was formally communicated by Mahamadou Sana, the minister responsible for public security. In his briefing, the plot was characterized not as an abstract threat, but as a multi-layered plan involving human assets, weapons, logistics, and cross-border coordination. Officials spoke of multiple methods under consideration: close-range gunfire, the use of explosives, and even the placement of mines near sensitive locations linked to the presidency. The intention, they said, was certainty to ensure the head of state would not survive. Equally troubling was the claim that the plan extended beyond a single individual. Authorities stated that the conspirators sought to disable key military and surveillance assets, including what was described as a drone-related installation. In modern counterinsurgency warfare, such infrastructure is not symbolic, it is operationally decisive. Disabling it, even temporarily, would create blind spots, confusion, and opportunity for follow-up attacks. From the government's perspective, this was not a spontaneous act by disgruntled individuals. It was described as a structured network with roles clearly assigned. The operational core, officials said, was inside Burkina Faso, particularly in and around Ouagadougou. But the command and control elements, according to the accusations, extended beyond national borders. That is where geography becomes critical. Investigators alleged that key communications and coordination traced back to Lomé, where former transitional leader Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba has been living in exile since his removal from power in September 2022. Authorities in Ouagadougou publicly identified him as the principal instigator, asserting that contacts were maintained through intermediaries, phone calls, and trusted civilian actors. A third point of gravity repeatedly mentioned during the televised discussion was Côte d'Ivoire. Some suspects reportedly had links there, and financing was alleged to have moved through commercial networks tied to Burkinabe nationals living abroad. The picture painted was a triangular arrangement planning and direction from Lomé financial facilitation linked to Abidjan and execution on Burkinabe soil. Security services emphasized that what allowed them to intervene in time was persistent intelligence monitoring. Rather than reacting after violence occurred, they claimed to have identified patterns, repeated contacts, unusual movements, and recruitment efforts targeting specific profiles within the security forces. Notably, officials suggested that this attempt differed from earlier plots by focusing less on senior officers and more on operational-level personnel, those with direct access to weapons patrol schedules and sensitive sites. On the night the plan was allegedly set to move from preparation to action, arrests were carried out. Those detained included both military personnel and civilians. Within days, several suspects appeared on national television, delivering detailed confessions that authorities argue corroborate their timeline and assessments. For the government, these events reinforced a single narrative: Burkina Faso is no longer facing isolated dissent, but a sustained campaign to reverse its current political trajectory. For supporters of President Traoré, it was proof that reforms and security realignments are provoking serious resistance. For critics, it raised questions about transparency, due process, and the use of televised confessions. But at this stage, before the debates, before the outrage, before the diplomatic fallout, the core fact remains the same. An operation was announced as foiled, an assassination attempt was alleged, and a nation woke up to realize how close it may have come to chaos. The moment the story crossed from allegation into national shock came not through a press release, but through a television screen. Across Burkina Faso, families watched as national broadcaster RTB aired what authorities described as direct confessions from individuals arrested in connection with the alleged plot. No dramatic music, no blurred faces, just uniforms, names, ranks, and voices recounting events in unsettling detail. At the center of this televised moment was Salfo Yalu, identified as a sergeant-chef of the Republican Guard. His testimony, delivered calmly, and at length would become the emotional and political climax of the entire affair. According to his statement, the sequence began weeks earlier with repeated calls from an unknown number. When he initially ignored them, the pressure shifted closer to home. A relative identified as a merchant and trusted intermediary urged him to answer. That call, he said, led to a meeting in Ouagadougou with a civilian contact who soon placed a phone call on speaker. The voice on the other end, he claimed, introduced itself as Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. What followed, as described on air, was not a fiery ideological speech, but something more calculated. Damiba, the sergeant, alleged, spoke as a fellow soldier. He acknowledged hardship, frustration, financial strain. Then came the proposal: mobilize men. Be ready. A commission would follow, money first, details later. The confession went further. On December 31st, the sergeant said he was instructed to collect a package. He described traveling in his vehicle with 2 PKM machine guns and multiple ammunition cassettes waiting for final instructions. Before that meeting could occur, security forces intervened. He and others were arrested late that night. As his testimony concluded, the sergeant asked for forgiveness from his superiors, from the armed forces, from the people, and from God. He repeated a single phrase: Burkina Faso is one and indivisible. That appeal did not soften the reaction. In the studio, analysts and former diplomats responded with visible anger. One guest dismissed the confession as proof not of remorse, but of betrayal, arguing that invoking God after agreeing to an assassination plan only deepened the offense. For him, the focus was not the rank-and-file soldier, but the figure he believed stood behind it all. The real question, he insisted, is not why a sergeant fell, but why a former head of state would allow his name to surface again and again. That phrase, again and again, echoed throughout the discussion. Panelists recalled that this was not the first time Damiba's name had appeared in destabilization claims since his removal from power in 2022. Dates were cited, patterns suggested. The implication was clear: exile in this narrative had not brought disengagement. The reaction quickly moved beyond emotion into strategy. Commentators emphasized that this operation appeared different from earlier coup attempts. Instead of courting senior generals, the alleged recruiters targeted operational personnel, men with direct access to weapons patrol schedules and sensitive sites. It was, they argued, a more discreet and dangerous approach. Security services were praised for what guests called anticipatory intelligence, monitoring contacts, mapping networks, and acting before violence unfolded. The arrests, they said, were not accidental. They were the result of weeks of surveillance and infiltration. Yet, even amid applause for the intelligence services, questions lingered. For some viewers, especially outside Burkina Faso, the use of televised confessions raised concerns about due process and narrative control. Supporters countered that the details were too specific, too consistent to be fabricated. By the end of the segment, the discussion had transformed the alleged plot from a secret operation into a national reckoning. The confessions did more than describe a failed attack. They forced the country to confront how close power, grievance, money, and memory still sit to one another. And as the broadcast faded, one truth remained unavoidable. Whether these events were the final act of an old struggle or the opening scene of a new one, Burkina Faso had crossed into a moment where silence was no longer possible. When the confessions stopped airing and the studio lights dimmed, the impact of the foiled plot did not fade with them. Instead, it moved outward, away from barracks and intelligence rooms, into the everyday lives of civilians and the fragile political balance of Burkina Faso. For ordinary Burkinabe families, the alleged plot was not processed as a chess match among elites. It landed as something far more personal. The idea that an assassination attempt could have unfolded in the middle of the night, possibly inside or near the presidential residence, triggered memories of past instability years when gunfire curfews and sudden regime changes were part of daily life. In markets and neighborhoods across Ouagadougou, conversations shifted quickly from prices and fuel shortages to a single uneasy question: how close were we to chaos? The government's narrative that this was not a protest or a mutiny, but a carefully organized operation amplified that fear. Officials spoke of weapons already mobilized, of infrastructure targeted for sabotage, of plans that extended beyond one individual. For civilians, this reframed the threat. It was no longer abstract politics. It was a reminder that violence, if unleashed, would not distinguish between leaders and bystanders. Politically, the consequences were just as heavy. Inside Burkina Faso, the episode hardened lines that were already forming. Supporters of Ibrahim Traoré interpreted the events as confirmation that his leadership and reforms are facing organized resistance, not only from ideological opponents, but from networks tied to the old order. The repeated references to figures associated with former power structures, commercial intermediaries, exiles, and political affiliations linked to past regimes fed a growing belief that the country is engaged in a deeper struggle over direction and sovereignty. For critics, however, the aftermath raised different concerns. They questioned whether the intense focus on televised confessions risks blurring the line between security enforcement and political messaging. In a nation still redefining its institutions, the balance between protecting the state and protecting due process remains sensitive. Even among those who accept the reality of the threat, there is unease about how such moments shape long-term governance norms. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the political ripples grew wider. The accusations placed unprecedented pressure on Togo, a neighbor traditionally seen as a mediator and safe haven. By alleging that coordination and communication occurred from Lomé, Burkinabe authorities effectively transformed a domestic security crisis into a regional diplomatic test. Even without formally accusing the Togolese state, the implication was unavoidable: a guest living under asylum could be destabilizing a neighboring country. This placed Lomé in a delicate position. On one hand, there is a long-standing tradition of offering refuge to leaders in danger. On the other, there is the responsibility to ensure that such hospitality does not become a platform for violence. For citizens in both countries, the stakes are not theoretical. A breakdown in trust could disrupt trade routes, border communities, and cooperation within the Sahel. The episode also reverberated through the broader alliance of Sahel states, where security cooperation is increasingly seen as existential. If destabilization efforts can move fluidly across borders through money phones and personal loyalties, then no member state is insulated. In the end, the foiled plot did more than expose an alleged conspiracy. It reopened unresolved questions about accountability, exile, and the lingering power of former leaders. It reminded civilians how fragile calm can be, and it forced political actors to confront a hard reality. The struggle over Burkina Faso's future is not confined to speeches or ballots. It is being fought in shadows, with consequences that reach far beyond any single night. From Washington to Brussels, what happened in early January 2026 in Burkina Faso did not register as a local drama. It was read as another signal from a region already described by Western analysts as one of the most volatile strategic theaters in the world. For American policymakers, especially those who remember the Cold War-era proxy conflicts and decades of coups across Africa, the alleged assassination plot against Ibrahim Traoré fits into a familiar but unsettling pattern. When governments attempt to redefine sovereignty, security partnerships, and economic control, resistance rarely stays confined to speeches or elections. It often reappears in the language of destabilization. Officially, the United States has not issued a detailed public reaction to the January plot, but silence should not be mistaken for indifference. In U.S. foreign policy circles, Burkina Faso is closely watched, not because of its size, but because of its position at the heart of the Sahel, a region where terrorism, migration routes, critical minerals, and great power competition intersect. Any serious instability there has ripple effects that reach Europe and eventually North America. From a Western security perspective, the most concerning element of the allegations is not the individual accused, but the mechanism described: cross-border coordination, use of exile networks, and recruitment within security forces. To American analysts, this mirrors scenarios seen elsewhere, from Latin America to the Middle East, where former power brokers attempt to regain relevance through indirect action rather than open confrontation. The situation also places unusual diplomatic weight on Togo. In global terms, Togo is often viewed as a stabilizing intermediary, quiet, pragmatic, and reliable. The suggestion that destabilization may have been coordinated from Lomé, therefore, creates discomfort among international partners. Even without accusing the Togolese state, the narrative forces allies to ask a difficult question: how does the international system handle political asylum when it intersects with alleged security threats? European observers share similar concerns. For them, instability in Burkina Faso directly affects migration pressure, regional trade, and counter-terrorism cooperation. The Sahel is already stretched thin. Another prolonged crisis would strain institutions that are barely holding. China and Russia, meanwhile, interpret the moment through a different lens. Both have expanded their influence in Africa by emphasizing sovereignty and non-interference. To them, accusations of foreign-linked destabilization reinforce long-standing arguments that Africa's instability is often fueled by unresolved external entanglements rather than purely internal failures. For older American viewers, this global response, or lack of a clear one, may feel eerily familiar. History offers many examples where warning signs were debated, minimized, or delayed until violence forced attention. The question now is whether Burkina Faso's situation will be treated as an early alarm or as just another headline in a crowded news cycle. Ultimately, what is unfolding is not simply about one alleged plot or one exiled leader. It is about whether nations redefining their political path will be allowed to do so without constant attempts at reversal. In that sense, Burkina Faso's moment resonates far beyond Africa. It speaks to a global tension between continuity and change, between systems that resist reform and societies determined to pursue it. And as international actors watch carefully, one thing is clear: the Sahel is no longer a peripheral concern. What happens there increasingly shapes conversations about security, sovereignty, and stability on a global scale. Sometimes the most dangerous moments in a nation's history are not marked by explosions or gunfire, but by how close they came. What Burkina Faso faced in early January 2026, as presented by its authorities and debated publicly, was not merely an isolated security incident. It was a warning. A reminder that the struggle over power, direction, and sovereignty does not end when one leader falls or another rises. It lingers, it adapts, and when unresolved, it often returns through shadows rather than speeches. For supporters of Ibrahim Traoré, the foiled plot reinforces a belief that the country's current course, its push for security reform, regional alignment, and political reset, has crossed a threshold where resistance becomes desperate. For critics, the episode raises equally serious concerns about how power is defended, how narratives are shaped, and how justice must be upheld, even in moments of danger. But beyond loyalty or opposition, there is a deeper issue at stake, one that resonates far beyond Burkina Faso. What happens when former leaders in exile are accused of continuing to influence events from afar? What responsibility do host nations carry when asylum intersects with alleged violence? And how many times can a region absorb destabilization before the consequences spill across borders? These questions are no longer theoretical. They now sit at the heart of West Africa's security debate, and increasingly within global conversations about sovereignty and stability. The Sahel is watching. So is the world. For older American audiences who have lived through decades of geopolitical cycles, coups, counter-coups, foreign interventions, and unfinished transitions, this moment may feel unsettlingly familiar. History teaches us that when reform challenges entrenched systems, the backlash is rarely polite. It is covert. It is patient. And it often tests the resolve of both leaders and citizens. The path ahead for Burkina Faso will not be decided by one failed plot or one televised confession. It will be shaped by how institutions respond, how regional partners act, and how ordinary people choose to engage with the future being offered to them. And that is where you come in. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective? Yet can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré, or should Burkina Faso prepare for a different kind of leadership ahead? If you feel that you are among the first to closely follow and support the journey of President Ibrahim Traoré, please share this story. If you believe that the truth matters more than headlines, more than propaganda, more than silence, subscribe and join the conversation. Because what is unfolding in Burkina Faso is not just Africa news. It is a chapter in the ongoing question of whether nations can finally choose their own future and defend it.